Good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction. So in a way, this paper nicely complements the presentation of Jesus, which we have just seen for the role of the zero lower bound. And I'm going to point out in various occasions of this presentation why. So this is work on climate change mitigation, how effective is green quantitative easing. It's joint work with a former doctoral student of mine, Rafaela Biri, then two courses from the ECB, Marin Ferdinand-Busse and Caroline Nährlich. And the usual disclaimer applies that these are the views expressed by the authors and not necessarily those of the European Central Bank. So what the point of departure of what we are doing is the need for climate change mitigation. And what we are going to do in this paper, we are going to compare two instruments in a very stylized manner. And the two instruments are green quantitative easing, short green QE, and carbon taxation. Our comparison is going to be with respect to the reduction of emissions, dirty emissions, as well as finally the reduction of the global temperature. And the way we understand green QE in this paper is it is a shift in the monetary authorities' private sector securities portfolio towards what is labeled as green assets. And we do not model the rationale for QE itself, we take it as given in a very specific way that I'm going to be precise about. What we do is we build an integrated assessment model of, and that's important, the entire world economy, which is in general equilibrium. And there's two production sectors. One is a clean sector and one is a dirty sector. And the dirty sector emits CO2. That CO2 in the climate change model is then leading to an increase of the global temperature, and that's going to lead to a damage of the aggregate production. So that's the usual production externality that's modeled in typical integrated assessment models. And a key feature of our setup is that the two sectors of production, they feature idiosyncratic risk on the returns. And this is important because it's going to imply that if the return correlation across the clean and the dirty sector of the economy is imperfect, then whenever the central bank steps in and purchases green assets, the private sector is not completely stepping up. So there's only going to be a partial crowding out in response to the monetary authorities reshifting of its portfolio. And that's a crucial mechanism in our model. So then, given that setup, we're going to consider three policy scenarios. One is a global carbon tax, a mild one, I would say. Then we contrast this with green quantitative easing, a relatively strong policy, I would say. And then we do a combination of the two instruments. The green quantitative easing is stylized, and we like to refer to this as a maximum green quantitative easing. So we think about this that within the framework of our model, we give green QE the maximum possible chance to have an effect. And the first one is that we assume that there is a perfect green-brown taxonomy. Second, we assume that there is a large size of the monetary authorities' portfolio in asset holdings. And here's the connection, and it is growing over time. So what we do here is we say that we basically do a stand-in for the idea that in a model with aggregate fluctuations, which we don't have, the zero lower bound will become occasionally binding in recessions that might be coming. And then again, the central bank will use a quantitative easing instrument. In our economy, which is deterministic at the aggregate level, we are going to assume this away, but assume that the share of the monetary authorities' asset holdings relative to the total capital stock is constant. So that if the capital stock is growing, also the capital stock held by the monetary authority is growing. And as I said, this just stands in that in the real world, the instrument quantitative easing might be used frequently in future recessions because of the zero lower bound becoming binding again. Then we assume a full and immediate shift towards the green assets. a high elasticity of substitution between clean and dirty goods, whereby an important sensitivity analysis is going to show explicitly what that implies for our findings, and the zero correlation of the returns. And again, in sensitivity analysis, we make that positive in order to show how relevant that is. Then we consider a moderate carbon tax of initially $50 at the time of introduction, which is 2021 in our model, but translate this into a tax rate, which is then held constant along the transition. So our main findings is that green QE contributes to climate change mitigation because of the imperfect crowding out. However, the carbon tax in our baseline calibration that within the setup of our model gives relatively strong power to green QE is about 4 times more effective. And green QE is complementary in a sense that if the carbon tax is already in place, it adds additional climate change mitigation. Yet the whole is less than the sum of its parts, meaning the total effect of green QE and carbon tax together is lower than if I sum up the individual contributions, individual policy experiments. The paper relates to a literature of using integrated assessment models along the transition of an economy. And there's a long literature on that, and we particularly relate to, in terms of like the quantitative easing element, to a recent paper that was developed in parallel by Ferrari and Lundy, where they do model the rationale for an effect of green QE through a utility motive and not, as in our models, through a financial market setup. Then there's a literature on the ESG models that look at the connection between climate and green monetary policy, hence focusing a little bit on the trade-off that on the one hand you have a climate objective, on the other hand you have a business cycle smoothing objective, and those two might be contradictory. Importantly, our work also refers to a literature on a carbon bias in the Eurosystem's corporate bond holdings. And in the sensitivity analysis, we are going to address that aspect, as well as, and this is important now, the literature on demographic change and climate change, which suppresses rates of return. And this contributes to a long literature that has shown this, where I myself have concluded, but contradicts Goethe and Phan, which in his introductory statement, Ken Rogoff also referred to yesterday. And I think that this book that basically says that after this inflationary episode is over that we currently observe, we will have inflationary pressures because of demographic change, gets one aspect fundamentally wrong. They feed into their model a consumption profile which is increasing in age, but what is in there is all the health expenditures, but they have to be financed by taxes, which they do not take into account. So they overstate the demand pressure and thus the inflationary pressure and also the upward pressure on rates of returns. And all of the literature that I've worked in always found that we have decreasing rates of returns. And in addition, climate change and the damage adds to this return pressure. And that is our motivation for holding the relative size of the quantitative easing constant in our experiments. Good, the model is complex. So what I'm going to give you here is a graphical visualization of the model elements. So on the final goods in the economy is going to be produced by a dirty and a clean intermediate goods sector. The dirty and the clean sector themselves use dirty and clean energy production. And there's going to be households. Households are going to supply labor to the two sectors and capital to those two sectors and labor to the energy producing sectors. And they will receive their incomes from the final goods sectors in terms of wage and asset income. The central bank, which throughout the analysis we refer to as a monetary authority, giving this a little bit of a more abstract connotation, is going to intervene in the market through holding assets in the clean and intermediate goods sector. And our green quantitative easing experiment is shifting that from the clean entirely to from the dirty entirely to the clean sector. The monetary authority gets profits, which it gives to the fiscal authority, and the fiscal authority taxes households through consumption taxes and pays back the receipts it has for the monetary authority as lump sum transfers. And it pays back the receipts as consumption taxes, not lump sum transfers, sorry. And it may tax the dirty energy production through a carbon tax. The dirty energy production itself is going to lead in the climate module of the model, and that's the integrated assessment model, to an accumulation of, through the emissions, to an accumulation of damages, and thereby to a temperature increase. In terms of equations, we are going to assume that the energy production takes labor and some productivity processes and comes at prices. And this is the same in the dirty as well as the clean sector of the economy. The final good here is produced as an imperfect substitution elasticity specification of the clean and dirty intermediate goods, whereby the aggregate damage from the climate module reduces aggregate output. So here's the climate externality. And the intermediate goods are themselves produced with Cobb-Douglas production, double nested Cobb-Douglas production using capital and labor, as well as energy in the respective sector. And those are sold at prices, dirty and clean prices, to the final goods producers. The households supply labor and capital, as well as labor to the energy production, capital and labor to the intermediate goods production, and hence have a budget constraint, whereas income, they have the returns on their capital holdings in the two sectors, as well as labor income, where the return is equalized across the two sectors, or the wage rate is equalized across the two sectors. And then on the expenditure side, they invest in the clean sector, the dirty sector, and consume as well as receive subsidies on their consumption, respectively pay consumption taxes. The climate module is such that the dirty energy production leads to emissions. Those emissions lead to an accumulation of the carbon stock in the overall world economy. This leads to a temperature increase, and that leads to an aggregate damage, which causes this aggregate production externality in the model. Finally, the monetary authority makes profits from the returns on the capital holdings that it has. And these profits go to the fiscal authority. The fiscal authority takes these profits, rebates them as consumption taxes, and in addition, may also have the carbon income taxes, which then leads to an increase of the consumption subsidies, also negative taxes. So this picture summarizes all the flows on goods and services, as well as taxes and profits in the economy. We take this model and calibrate it to an initial steady state, which is year 2010. And then we look at a transition in the baseline scenario and basically look at an observation period for the next 80 years, so from 2020 roughly to 2100. And the monetary authority's capital is along this transition going to be proportional to private and clean capital, and there is no carbon tax. That's the baseline scenario. In the policy scenarios, we then add a carbon tax. Then in the second policy scenario, we only look at green quantitative easing, which is a shift from the dirty to the clean capital holdings. And then we consider both scenarios together. In terms of the calibration of the model, let me very briefly point out some of the features. One is we calibrate a relatively high elasticity of substitution between the two intermediate goods. And we do calibrate it to match in our model as elasticity of energy substitution relative to price change, relative price changes of the energy goods of 2. So the value of 2 we take from the literature, and then we use cross-equation restrictions in our model to calibrate this very high substitution elasticity. In the sensitivity analysis, I'm going to show you results if we calibrate this to a value of 1, and this implies that this value goes down to 2.5. And that's important. The other one that is important is we look at the literature on how assets in a clean and a dirty sector of an economy are correlated, asset returns. And we find that the literature supports, or part of the literature supports, a zero correlation. Another strand of literature rather supports a correlation coefficient of 0.4. Again, in the sensitivity analysis, we are going to look at it. Another element I want to point out, this is a model in which we are going to have CRA preferences, so not Epstein-Zinn or something, and there is also not going to be any tail risk in the economy. So we need a high risk aversion coefficient to match a risk-free rate of 3%. That is wishful thinking. We would love to match a lower risk-free rate, but for technical reasons, the model does not run if we try to calibrate it lower. It doesn't really matter because that's the baseline pass, and everything that happens in this model is relative to this baseline pass. And the monetary authorities' portfolio holdings are such that the capital stock in the monetary authority in both sectors is 4% of the total capital stock. So this is at the upper end of what we observe in the real world. So we have a relatively strong quantitative easing to begin with. And here there's equal shares. Again, in the sensitivity analysis, we are going to look at a carbon bias in the initial central banks or monetary authorities' bond holdings. Let me now show you a little bit of the exogenous driving forces. So we feed into the model population dynamics we take from the United Nations divisions, a population division. And in the initial baseline, we assume that there is no demographics in the model. So basically, we assume that a retirement age increases such that the working age to population ratio is constant. In the sensitivity analysis, we have a scenario in which that is not the case. We assume by reference to the literature in climate economics that the energy productivity in the clean sector grows faster than in the dirty sector. And in the final productivity, the final goods productivity has a constant growth. What this is going to imply, this assumption on relative productivity growth, is that clean goods, clean energy becomes cheaper, dirty energy becomes, clean energy, sorry, becomes cheaper, dirty energy more expensive. Also implies that in the baseline, the clean energy grows therefore faster than the dirty one. And that the relative price in of the intermediate goods of dirty relative to clean goods is increasing, and thus the output of dirty goods is decreasing. Even though this is the case, CO2 emissions are constantly increasing. If that were stronger, we would observe a hump shape here. But we see this constant increasing, and this constant increasing also of the global temperature. And we end up at 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and that's in line with the IPCC projections. The side comment on the rates of return, here you see the rates of return in the risky assets and the risk-free rate. The climate change externality suppresses rates of return, and thereby the risk-free rate is basically constant along the transition, which again, this justifies our notion of repetitive quantitative easing in a more realistic model with aggregate fluctuations, respectively holding it constant in our model. And if we feed in a time-varying working age population ratio so that we have demographic change, this return pressure is even stronger. And this is consistent with previous literature. Now, in our policy experiments, what we do is, in the carbon tax experiment, we say that up an impact in year 2021, we introduce a $15 target carbon tax per unit of CO2 submissions, per unit of CO2 stock, which is 13.6 per unit of flow. And this is then being held constant so that in terms of relative to the dirty energy price, as a tax rate of 0.4%, so that the level is increasing along the transition. And the central bank's capital stock in the policy experiment, we are going to do a full shift of dirty holdings to zero towards the green holdings of the monetary authorities' capital holdings. Now, in terms of what the policy experiments do, the carbon tax is going to lead to an increase of the price of dirty energy because of the tax. This is unaffected in the quantitative easing experiment. The dirty energy return has an opposite pattern. If the monetary authority reduces its capital holdings, marginal products in the dirty sector go up, and hence the rate of return in the dirty sector of the economy goes up. And that's important for understanding why green QE in part is less effective than carbon taxes. And I'm going to explain this later in more detail. So now this is on the slide. Now the carbon tax has two mechanisms how it's going to affect the economy by the dirty energy price increase. That's making the dirty goods more expensive, hence dirty good production goes down, and the dirty energy demand also goes down. That is true for the final goods production, and in the intermediate goods production, the increase of the dirty energy prices also reduces dirty energy production. So here, through two channels, it reduces the dirty energy production. The carbon tax, the green QE, in contrast, has two mechanisms. First of all, through the increase in the final goods reduction of the returns, through making dirty capital more costly, it's going to reduce dirty output and hence dirty energy demand. However, due to the fact that dirty capital becomes more expensive, in the intermediate goods production, there is a partial substitution to demanding more dirty energy. And that channel mitigates the effectiveness of green QE relative to carbon taxation. So this is basically also shown here in this picture, where you show that as a response to the carbon taxation, dirty energy use relative to output goes down, whereas in the green quantitative easing, it goes slightly up. Likewise, opposing effects here, the green quantitative easing by construction reduces the capital stock relative to output in the dirty sector. The carbon tax, since it suppresses output more, leads to a slight increase of the capital output ratio in the dirty sector of the economy. Let me now go to the key results on emission reductions. In our experiments, the carbon tax leads to a reduction of dirty emissions, whereby the green QE is about 4 times less strong than that. So that as a net effect, the global temperature in the carbon tax experiment goes down until 2100 by 1.6 degrees of Celsius. In the green QE, this is only 0.04. So again, roughly 4 times less effective. An alternative experiment or alternative question we can ask is, what would it take to make the carbon tax as effective as green QE? And then we would need only a $3 in $11 per ton of carbon emissions carbon tax instead of the $50 that we have in the baseline scenario. In terms of the temperature reduction, let me just ask about combining the two instruments. And this is a little bit hard to see here, but you see basically that the effect of the tax and QE is larger than having the carbon tax alone. So the purple line is underneath the red line. So in that sense, green QE doesn't do any harm. The effect is relatively mild, but it helps. And here is the aspect of what I mentioned in the introduction. The whole is less than the sum of its parts. So the combination of having the QE alone and having the QE and the tax, and then we take out the effect of the tax alone, leads to a lower effect. So in other words, QE in isolation is more effective than if the carbon tax is already there. Finally, this picture illustrates a little bit the imperfect crowding out. So the monetary authority in the policy experiment reduces the holdings in the dirty energy sector and shifts it fully to the clean sector. Households react to this by reshuffling their portfolios, but it's not completely offset because of the imperfect correlation of the asset returns. So now let me go a little bit to sensitivity analysis. You've seen that in terms of the relative effectiveness of the global temperature reduction, the carbon tax is about 4 times more effective than green QE. If we say instead that the holdings of the central bank of assets is a constant and not constantly growing, so that in the limit, the size of the capital held by the central bank relative to the overall economy goes to 0, then green QE would only be 15 times less effective than the carbon tax. On the other hand, if we calibrate the model to reflect an initial CO2 bias, as suggested by this recent work by Monica Piazzesi, Martin Schneider, and Papuzzi, then the effect of green QE is only 3 times less effective than the global carbon tax. The other aspect is, suppose we calibrate the model to a very low substitution elasticity, then the effectiveness of the carbon tax increases relative to green QE quite substantially. If we assume a positive correlation of returns, then the effectiveness of green QE relative to the baseline does not decrease that much. So here, the low substitution elasticity, that's of course a crucial question. How large is the substitution elasticity across sectors in the long run? Ours is a very long run model, so maybe the number of 26 is not so unrealistic after all. Good, let me summarize here. So I'm going to summarize this green arrows for having lower effects that lead to lower CO2 emissions, brown arrows for effects that lead to higher CO2 emissions. The carbon tax leads to lower CO2 emissions because of lower demand for dirty intermediate goods and lower demand for dirty energy. Green QE leads to lower demand for dirty intermediate goods, but due to the substitution from energy in the intermediate goods sector, from energy to other factors, namely capital and labor, it leads to a higher demand for energy. And there's a partial crowding out of private capital. And these effects together explain why green QE is less effective than the carbon tax. So that in our baseline, the relative effectiveness is about 4 in terms of the global temperature reduction, or green QE is equivalent to a carbon tax of $3. But green QE, as I also said, is complementary to the carbon tax. And with that statement, I want to close and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, the Professor Ludwig. Your presentation to describe the visualization of your big model is very the informative. It's easy to understanding the whole structure of the model, and the outcome is surprising because the tax the carbon tax and the green QE both are the has the price channel the effect. But the outcome, the magnitude of the impact on the outcome is quite different. So I would like to invite Dr. Toan Phan from the Federal Reserve Bank of the Richmond. Dr. Phan, thank you so very much to join our conference, and please start your comment.
Do you see my screen?
Yes, yeah, please.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me here to discuss this nice presentation. So just let me start with the big picture. I think the question that many of us, the various central banks around the world, some of the question having in our minds is that what role could or should central banks play in addressing climate change and its related risks? And I think that in general, the two kind of I try to categorize this kind of question into two different kind of subcategories. One, it is central bank-led adaptation. But I mean the question of how should we, how do climate risks affect the macro economy and the financial stability? And therefore, if they do, then would that imply that there's warranted policy responses? And there's a lot of kind of policy response being discussed right now, going from disclosure of carbon risk, of carbon emissions, to supervision of various different financial institutions, to doing the idea of stress testing. I think many of our colleagues across different central banks are investigating this on their own work. Then the other aspect is central bank-led mitigation. Right? So the question there is, can central bank or should central bank do anything to help facilitate the green transition? And this is where this paper comes in, and is this mitigation approach. And obviously, it's a very relevant topic because, as you know, for example, the European Central Bank have explicitly have a plan to tackle climate change through its corporate sector asset purchase program. And I will get to that in more in a second. And it's and very kindly, my colleague and friend Daiso Ikeda at the Bank of Japan pointed to me that the BOJ had its own strategy on climate change, coming from the announcement to the outline of the program and more, and to the first disbursement in last December. And the outline of the program idea is to provide funds to financial institutions at pretty much zero interest rate. Within the amount, the whole point is to help support the private sector's efforts on climate change. So they're giving pretty much discount loans to clean firms, if you want, or if you want to put in the perspective of Alex's model. So Alex and his co-authors in that paper, what did they do? Alex did a good job presenting. So I'm not gonna spend too much time summarizing the paper. But I just want to say that there's a model of a two sector that is clean and dirty. Is going to the tradition of GSG models, and here is a model of a global economy with the DICE integrated framework. So we have this climate module following the kind of Nordhaus, and then also more recently the Golosov et al. Econometrica 2014 paper. And so then that's also as typical in the DICE literature and the integrated assessment models there. There's a fiscal authority who can levy carbon tax, right? And again, by the way, my colleague Linda Barrage, she has several very interesting papers addressing these fiscal policies about optimal carbon tax, even in the presence of distortionary tax. And anyways, and more importantly here is that there is a monetary authority who can directly hold dirty or clean capital stock. So the notation is KMD or KMC. And the assumption is that the total portfolio size is fixed. So think about it, the total central bank portfolio is fixed. The key thing is that they can change the mix, right? So the green quantitative easing would be to reduce the holding of the dirty capital and increase the holding of clean capital, right? And then as the authors acknowledged, is a stylized ways to model central banks providing these kind of loans or purchasing corporate bonds. We get into that in a second. The main finding is that by reshuffling the central bank's balance sheet, the green QE cannot do too much, right? So I think Alex pointed out various reasons why. At the magnitude, even going to maximum green QE, but that means pretty shutting down, the holding of dirty capital can only reduce global warming by like 0.04 degrees Celsius by the end of the century in the benchmark calibration, and equivalently only as cost effective as a carbon tax of roughly $11 per ton of carbon or $3 per ton of CO2. I mean, just a benchmark. The relevant benchmark in the paper used for the carbon tax is $50 per ton of carbon. So these are pretty small, small effects. So that's the summary of the paper. So my comments are as follows. I have several of them. The first one, so first general observation is it is a very careful analysis of a complex model with many moving pieces, from both the DSG literature and also from the DICE frameworks, right? And I know there's a lot of work that the authors have done in delving into this, developing this paper. So I appreciate that. My main suggestions and questions, the first one is, are you giving green QE a fair chance? By that I mean the model do not have financial frictions, in particular heterogeneous frictions across clean versus dirty sectors, and also there's absence of path dependency. I won't go into details of that in the next few slides. I have also less major comments about modeling global economy versus one particular closed economy versus the rest of the world, and I'll have some comments about calibrating tail risks. So let's go into the financial frictions, right? So in practice, credit matters. In fact, all of the kind of QEs, green QEs we see now is going through to the debt market, right? So in the ECB, they're buying corporate bonds. The Bank of Japan, they're providing these kind of loans, either to clean or dirty firms. Why is this important? In practice, dirty firms, they tend to be larger, tend to be older. So they tend to face fewer credit frictions than the clean ones, who tend to be younger, and have less tangible capital. So as a consequence, for example, it's documented in Papuzzi, Piazzesi, and Schneider paper on the green QE that many of us are familiar with. They document that naturally the dirty bonds, they dominate the European Union corporate bond market. So the green bonds are very few, right? Because they're younger. The market is younger. The firms are less financially integrated. Right? So not modeling credit frictions may bias the results, right? So just in my mind, right? In a model where clean firms face strong credit frictions, right? Then subsidized loans and credit injections from the central bank can potentially have much bigger effects. Just think of the kind of the classic amplification mechanism in Kiyotake and Moore or Bernanke-Gillis, right? This is obviously when the firms facing stronger frictions, a little bit of help can go a long way. And also, naturally, when you have this asymmetry financial friction there could be more room for central banks for making the central bank portfolio cleaner, right? So the initial balance sheet, if it's under the market neutral kind of benchmark, the initial balance sheet might be skewed heavily to the dirty sector, again, as documented by Papuzzi for the ECB. And there's there's more room for the central bank to adjust its initial dirty portfolio. And actually, in updated sensitivity analysis that Alex sent me recently, in this current framework without financial friction, this fact already matters. But I think in the framework with financial friction, this can even matter more, right? This adjustment from the initially very dirty one to a much cleaner one. All right, so financial friction matters, right? And there's another related aspect is there's the model doesn't capture potentiality of minimum scale, or I would call it the clean poverty trap, right? So another way to make it model more interesting is that assume the production function has some kind of initial convexity, like sort of like an S-shaped curve if you think of the poverty trap kind of story. I think it's relevant because for clean energy, right? How to achieve a sufficient scale is important, right? Then sufficient credit capital injection from the central bank to help the green sector to escape the poverty trap. The initial convex part can help. Think of the reduced form of the big green push, if you want. And then in that case, right, not only that the effects can be bigger for the green QE, but also optimal green QE or in general industrial policies may only have to be in place temporarily until the clean sector get out of the initial poverty trap, right? And this is very related to the idea that in an environment with directed technical change, optimal green R&D policy subsidy is only needed until clean technology, which is initially behind, have caught up with the dirty technologies, well documented in this recent, this literature following the Acemoglu work in AER 2012 or the follow-up JPE 2016 papers. And generally, I think the implication for green QEs for the dynamics of green transition will be much more interesting in this kind of environment. Other comments quickly, I'm running low on time. The more I think of a global central bank, we don't have one. I think an alternative is to calibrate the model to like a closed economy like the European Union or the Bank of Japan here, and add some exogenous stress of world emission process. The calibrating of carbon cycle and climate change, as the model is calibrated as in the Golosov economic checkup paper. But since then, much more updated and arguably more realistic calibrations have been developed. I encourage the author to look at Kai and Lonchek for discussion of this. You don't have to redo it, but I think I encourage you to acknowledge the limitations of this current calibration and discuss the more recent ones. And one particular lesson I learned from Kai and Lonchek JP paper is that the climate tipping risk matters a lot in a DICE model with Epstein-Zinn preferences, right? I'm happy to talk about that if you have questions. And another thing is elasticity substitution, which is a key parameter in certain models. Could matter a little, or like in the baseline DICE model or in Golosov paper, but could matter a lot. It's in the path dependence framework, like the green technical directed change following Acemoglu, right? So how important this parameter C here? My guess is C matters a lot more if there's a financial frictions or there's a poverty trap, right? Anyway, so I conclude the paper that carefully addressed an important question: to what extent could central bank policy facilitate green transition? And I think it's an important initial step, in the growing literature. Let me just stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Phan. It's very interesting to compare the price channel by ECB with the quantity channel by the Bank of Japan. So, Professor Ludwig, could you please reply for his comment?
Yeah, thank you very much for the discussion. And yeah, one sent me the slides beforehand, and thank you very much for that. So I knew what was coming, and I left out all of the comments of the things we could extend the model along, and left it entirely to him on comment on that. So yeah, let me take this up. I agree with everything that he says. In particular, I mean, in a way that the way that we think about our paper is an important first step in bringing the finance perspective in with the explicit notion of risk in the two sectors. But clearly, credit frictions are important, and at least in the short run, they would have an effect. I'm not so sure about the long run. I thought about the initial convexity. My question about it would be how to calibrate it, so that I'm not so sure about. So in that sense, the initial credit frictions might be easier. And with that also, like what you said about the poverty trap, going into a full directed technology change paper is, of course, would be another paper to write, which is of course very interesting. And it's also interesting what you pointed out on the interaction between the substitution elasticity and the frictions, which I haven't thought about so far. As well as thanks for the pointing out of the literature on our need for an update of the climate module. So thanks so much for the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the Professor Ludwig. The first question comes from the Professor Orphanidis. Orphanidis, please.
Thank you, Chair. It always takes a few seconds to arrange the video and the audio. And thank you, Alexander, for the very, very interesting analysis. My question relates to the governance challenge of asset purchases as discussed in yesterday's Mayakawa lecture by Ken Rogoff. We can all agree that mitigating climate change is essential, and you very nicely show in the paper how a carbon tax is an effective solution. So when it comes to the role of central banks, I can think of two very different approaches to asset purchases that I hope you can give some light on. Approach number one is green QE, exactly as you discuss it in the paper, which is effectively a subsidy to a specific sector of the economy over others. Now, approach two is normal QE, and this is purchases of government debt exclusively, which effectively empowers the government to decide how much of the proceeds from the sale of additional debt to use to purchase green bonds or to use the subsidies to benefit climate change. Now, in my view, and relating to what we had yesterday, best governance argues for approach two, exclusive purchase of government debt, not green QE. With exclusive purchase of government debt, the central bank remains as neutral as possible with respect to sectoral distribution effects. And this approach can replicate green QE because the government can then buy or provide subsidies as the government sees best. It has proper governance and gives government all of these options for additional policies that are not possible if the central bank intervenes and does QE. So given how problematic the governance approach of the central bank interfering with specific sectors with green QE, and the risk that such sectoral interventions would politicize the central bank, is there any reason at all why we're discussing green QE over normal QE, where the government would have the flexibility to do all of the policies, including the carbon tax, as you suggest?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very good comment. Let me comment on this in two ways. First of all, I agree. And second, on our to-do list for an extension would be, let's look at normal QE, take the revenues, and use that as a subsidy for the clean sector.
That's right.
A natural experiment. Here we ask a simple what-if question. And without going into the governance at all, and I think we should probably discuss the governance aspects a little bit more. I say this now with more emphasis because just yesterday I was witnessing a presentation of an insurance company on the European efforts to have the ESG, so environment, social, and governance program, and how much bureaucracy comes with that. And we do not know what the costs of all this bureaucracy is that we have now. And it would maybe be much more efficient if we just let the government tax carbon, the central bank to normal QE, take that revenue and subsidize the clean sector of the economy. I fully agree with that. And this is in our framework would be very nice, interesting follow-up work.
Thank you for this. I think it will be very important if you add that a few paragraphs in the paper, because I think it's a very important contribution of the academic community to guide the policy world, including central banks, in this important issue of how this can be done properly with proper governance and with the delineation of democratic accountability that we have. Your paper is just very nicely set up to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor on this. So second question comes from the Dr. Anton Brown. Anton Brown, please.
Enjoyed your presentation very much, Alexander. I want to talk a little bit more about opportunities for central banks to take actions that promote the green sector. And the institutions obviously vary depending on the country. Japan is interesting because the Bank of Japan is holding Nikkei ETFs on its balance sheet. And so it has the opportunity to change the portfolio along the lines that your model, that they're analyzed in your model. A second possibility is the one that was raised by Toan in his discussion, and that is offering subsidized credit to financial intermediaries. A third one came up yesterday, and that is there's a push by people such as Gary Gorton to encourage central banks to provide basically stable coins. And so there's a sense in which you're promoting a these DeFi activities that are potentially use a lot of carbon. And so I was wondering, from the perspective of your work, do you have any specific recommendations for the relative efficacy of these three types of strategies? And then a final question is, just very quickly, United States, the Fed has very limited opportunities to intervene in financial markets. We can buy mortgage-backed securities, or we can buy government debt. Clearly, there's a discussion now about the buying the government debt. But those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I must admit, we are a bit playing on what you said. For the subsidized credit, we obviously can do that if we extend the model, and then I can say something on the relative efficacy of these instruments. Haven't done that yet. On the stable coins, unfortunately I had to go to a different presentation yesterday, so I missed half of the day yesterday. So I didn't hear that. So it would be nice if you could maybe in private conversation send me that again, because I don't fully understand it. And last, your last comment on the US having limits in intervening in the financial market. I think that also goes back to one of the points of Toan in the discussion, that we have this global monetary authority that does all the same, and it would be more realistic to have a model in which you have the European Union and other countries in the world. And that's certainly something that I'm also thinking about for future research. So thanks a lot. I take this as a lot of food for thought, and I'm sorry that I cannot give precise answers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brown. You mentioned about the DeFi, the decentralized financial system. The size of the market, the new market, is quite small, but it has a potential to be a third channel to providing the credit in the new the financial system. Yeah. So thank you for the nice presentation and the question, the discussion.